about. So Chris, you ready?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
We can. Well, so welcome.
Sweet. Well, Steve, Joe, Raj, thank you guys for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure to join you. I think I'm the only thing standing between you and the hotly anticipated presidential debate tonight, which I will have to drink with watch with a large amount of alcohol, if I'm going to manage to watch it at all. But it's a real pleasure to be with you guys. And for this, this is really for you guys. I want you to get out of this what's going to be most valuable. So I'm happy to take the conversation wherever you want to go. Nothing is off limits topics wise, really eager to do what is ever going to be most useful for you all. And I would like to get into that sort of dialogue and discussion as fast as possible. I'll make a handful of just, kind of water top remarks here. And then we can really dive into Q&A. I get asked why I wrote the book, and believe me, it was a question that I spent every day that I was writing the book asking myself, why on earth did I decide to do this? And, ultimately, I think it boils down to in the time that I spent in the Senate in particular, and in the last 4 years, to Steve's comment about my bio on the Senate Armed Services Committee, just growing increasingly concerned that the United States was falling behind and nobody was really paying attention to the extent of that problem. My book is very focused on, and my thinking is very kind of focused on national defense. There's a lot, obviously, that encompasses, kind of national security strategy that goes far above and beyond the military. That really wasn't the subject of what I was focused on. I was really looking at it more narrowly through, at the problem facing, national defense and the U.S. military. And I guess if I could boil that problem down, I would say that, kind of riffing off of what Joe said, we've been dominant for an extremely long period of time. I think many of us don't actually have much in the way of living memory of a period when we were not, militarily dominant. Unfortunately, the reality is that, we are being disrupted, and I would argue have been disrupted in a very fundamental way, in a way that I actually think most Americans and most members of Congress don't fully understand and appreciate. And, what I wanted to try to do in the book, was really try to focus, for more of a general audience. I kind of thought of it, as writing for my mom and dad, informed, educated, paying attention, but really not deep into the questions of national defense and the sort of ecosystem. And, wanted to try to explain, what I think is not immediately a thesis that, people would sort of agree with, or it doesn't strike people as obvious. And as I see it, the problem is sort of, on the one hand, we're being disrupted by competitors, and in particular, great power competitors, and in particular, China. And when you actually look at the decisions that, China in particular has been making over a very long period of time in a very methodical way, they have been modernizing and building up a military, not to do things the way the United States has done, but to build up a different kind of force, specifically and explicitly focused on undermining the core assumptions on which the United States has been planning to project military power for 25 to 30 years. And again, this disruption has not been, like a hurricane or an earthquake that sort of hit us one day without warning or unexpectedly. It's something that has been in process, playing out year by year, kind of relatively speaking in full view. And, we have been, the United States has been, kind of a classic frog in the pot, of watching a process of disruption playing out. And to some extent being paralyzed by, sort of our own inability to respond effectively to that disruption. At a more specific level, that disruption looks like essentially, what competitors have been doing to put in place military capabilities and operational concepts to fundamentally undermine, the things that the United States has always believed it would have in military competitions. I mean, Joe referenced a lot of that. We would be able to fight on timelines of our choosing. We would control the timing and tempo of military competition and operations. We would be able to sort of build up forces and operate from sanctuaries that an adversary really wouldn't have a lot of capability to contest. whether that was forward operating bases in, regions of interest, or the information domain or the space domain. These are things, logistics, the ability to actually move combat power into places that you need it. These are things that we've come to take for granted as just, they will be there and ready when I need them, because we have been operating for so long in a permissive environment. And then ultimately, we've assumed that we would have military technological superiority over any competitor that we faced, that our forces would be able to move and shoot and communicate with near impunity, and qualitatively dominate, even quantitatively superior adversaries. And if you look at the decisions, the programs, the weapons systems, the doctrine that our competitors, great power competitors, have been putting in place for a very long time, it is fundamentally geared on calling into question all of those core assumptions on which US military power has been built, and surpassing it. Simultaneously, you have a disruption at the level of technology. The defense establishment, what I refer to in the book as the defense establishment, what my previous boss lovingly referred to as the military industrial congressional complex, of the Department of Defense, the military, civilian leadership, the Congress, both bodies, both parties, and then defense industry, and all of its different sort of flavors. That is an ecosystem. And since the end of the Cold War in particular, it has become increasingly concentrated, consolidated, uncompetitive, and essentially hollowed out when you look at kind of smaller companies that have failed to scale into larger companies, and middle tier companies that have either been bought up or driven out of business. So we have this sort of calcified industrial base that is quite good at producing certain kinds of capabilities. But when you look at the types of capabilities and technologies that I think, over the past few years in particular, you see senior leaders in US national defense calling out as increasingly central to military advantage in the future. Technologies that you all are talking about regularly, from artificial intelligence and machine learning to autonomous systems, distributed networking, advanced manufacturing, on and on and on, commercial space. These are technologies that have accelerated in their development over the past, 10, 15, 20 years, largely driven by commercial innovation and commercial companies. Oftentimes, more often than not, those companies have little interest in working with the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense doesn't make it exceedingly interesting for those companies, or easy for those companies to work with it. So what you've seen is again, sort of a simultaneous disruption at the level of technology, where we have gotten extremely good about building a force around very small numbers of very expensive, exquisite, heavily manned and hard to replace military systems. And the reality is that the future is going to be much more dominated by things that are not military platforms. Networking, the movement of information, the weaponization of data, how you operate large quantities of relatively smaller, cheaper, more autonomous, more intelligent military systems. And that's something that we've seen, beginning to play out for some time. But again, our defense establishment has been caught rather flat-footed by, innovations in software development, commercial space, revolutions in artificial intelligence and machine learning and computer vision and vehicle autonomy. These technologies, it's hard to overstate the degree to which these technologies just are not available inside of the Department of Defense, for service members and service men and women. And what I'd say, just to kind of wrap things up here, is much of my book, comes off as quite pessimistic and cynical, and maybe that's the product of spending the better part of the decade in Congress. It sort of builds up a tough outer shell of cynicism. I'm actually an optimist at a certain level, and my optimism is rooted in the fact that when you look at the systemic things that we would need to execute a strategy of change, the kinds of quotes that you put up there from General Dunford and General C.Q. Brown, what you hear uniformed military leaders and civilian defense leaders talking about the necessity of right now. We have amazing first-rate, world-leading technology in this country. We have remarkable human beings in government and out of government, entrepreneurial, critical thinking, well-educated, highly motivated people. We have a ton of money. I mean, we talk constantly about shortfalls in defense spending. We're spending $700 billion on our military. And last I checked, we have an economy of about $18 trillion. On any given day, a lot of that money is sort of sitting on the sidelines looking for good things to do in a totally non-ideological way. So we've got money. The challenge we have, to sort of be blunt about it, is us. We have met the enemy, and it is us. We keep blocking our own kicks. We keep fighting over, at a political level, things that are impeding our ability to change. We have built up a system to produce a certain type of military power at a time where that whole business model is being disrupted and undermined in much the same way that, Blockbuster Video's business model was undermined by Netflix and Apple. And, to sort of echo the point that Joe made, my belief here is that we have been put into a position of playing a losing game, by the choices our competitors have made and by disruptions in commercial technology. The surest way to lose a losing game is by continuing to play it on the terms you've been playing it. We need to do something different. Business as usual is not going to work. We need a disruption to our thinking and our approach to building and fielding and operating military capability. That is something that will inherently involve the Department of Defense, Congress, and defense industry, both new and old. And my belief is that, again, the reason I'm an optimist is because I believe that our destiny still is in our own hands. The question is whether we can actually change at the level that we're going to need to, at the speed we're going to need to, at the sense of urgency that we're going to have to. And ultimately that comes down to changing incentives. I don't believe that we have gotten, into the problem or the predicament that we're in by accident. It's a function of the incentives that we have created over a very long time, some conscious, some unconsciously created. But incentives can be changed. The Department of Defense, as a buyer of technology and capability, can buy different capability. They can create different incentives for different type of industry to work with them and for them. They can create incentives for all of that private capital sitting on the sidelines to flow back into the defense sector in a way that hasn't happened for a very long period of time. I do believe these are solvable problems. I don't believe that culture or anything else is an impediment to us succeeding. I think the question fundamentally boils down to whether we have the imagination to recognize that change isn't optional. If we fail to change, we're going to end up in a world that is very unlike the world that we've enjoyed for a long period of time, and it's not going to be a better world. So having the imagination and sort of the willingness and sense of urgency to change is something that we're going to have to do. And then I think speaking down to like the eaches of how you change incentives and what that really looks like is something I'd be happy to talk through. And, to Raj's point, it absolutely involves the Congress, and Congress has awesome power to contribute to the type of change that we're talking about. My experience all too often has been that, the Congress uses the awesome power that it has in ways that are just, far below the level that, are really required to make change at scale. They play around the margins, they pick fights over trivial issues. Whereas I think where we really need to see Congress engaging is on, some of these really significant questions of how you scale innovative and disruptive technology, how you put in place the processes that determine, how you can pick winners and losers and really reward winners at scale. These are things that I think Congress, to some extent, is going to be, I would actually argue completely, is going to be indispensable to, reinforcing what the department is trying to do and correct the department when it gets it wrong, which is often. And I'm now living this dream from the standpoint of a small technology startup, where I've been now for the better part of 2 years. To some extent, it's kind of reaffirmed a lot of the things that I thought while I was in government. Now I just have the pleasure of living it at an emotional level on a day-to-day basis. To a certain extent, I've learned a lot of things that, I really wish that I had known back when I was in government and had a lot more influence to sort of, affect the process of change from the standpoint of the Congress. And happy to get into that as well. So I'll shut up and stop monologuing. Would love to dive in, really take this wherever you want to go. Nothing's off limits. I'm eager to, to talk with all of you and take this wherever you want to go.
So Joe, one question each from the teaching team and then the students. Is that how you want to do it?
Great, Stephen. Well, Chris, first of all, just thanks for all you've done, really for all of us in so many important roles. And I know you got a lot of runway left, so look forward to seeing more of you. Your book was, as intended, disturbing, but, I took it as a real call to action. And I think encouraging our leadership, at the senior levels, that, the good news is that at least we acknowledge that we have a problem, but certainly, much entrenched inertia is out there. And I think you're exactly right. The enemy is us. So I guess the question is, is it going to take a bloody nose or worse, or will that be too late? I mean, do you think we can regain our dominance, or at least at a minimum, be in a position to sustain that rules-based order that we established after the Second World War, and made all this economic miracles possible? Or are we going to cede it to a competitor with a different vision? And do you see this happening, or do you see it's going to take something really, really bad to get our attention and, finally change? And will that be too late?
Yeah, I think if it comes to that, it's going to be too late. As a student of history, I would say, unfortunately, America learns these lessons the hard way. I'd like to think that we won't repeat that experience again. Frankly, I'm heartened by a lot of the things that I see, senior leaders in the executive branch and the legislative branch saying. We are having a different conversation about these topics than we were back when Raj and I were shouting into the abyss together in 2014 and 15 and those types of times. That's good. I mean, you can mark that progress. It's frustrating that it's taking years to get there, but I do believe it's moving in the right direction. I think, though, to some extent now, we've kind of reached the hardest stage. We've admitted that we have a problem. We've admitted that we need to do things differently. Now we get down to, the difficult questions of execution and implementation, which is where we have foundered in the past. It's not been for lack of people saying the right things that we've, ended up in the position that we're in. It's because we have failed to do so many of the things that we have said for, in many cases, 2 to 3 decades are essential. So, I would like to believe that it's not going to take, that sort of, horrific cataclysmic event to force us to realize that, we really need to do this differently. And I think part of the challenge, honestly, is, I think we're facing competitors who recognize that they don't want to create that type of position for us, and I think you can look back over the past 25 years and say, there's probably a half a dozen Sputnik moments that should have been Sputnik moments for us, and they haven't been. So, how can we, kind of galvanize ourselves in the absence of an overt sort of, completely obvious, Sputnik moment or bloody nose or, a catastrophic event. I think that is the challenge of leadership. That is the challenge that our leaders have right now. And, for my small part in this, the reason I wanted to write a book for a general audience was to try to sort of put the problem in plain English for people to wrestle with, in the hope that, more folks who are paying attention and concerned about where we are, might actually help those incredibly good people who are in our government right now, trying to make this process of change in the arena.
So Chris, great answer, and thanks for being here. Question is just a congressional question, or so I guess it's been twice in the last 75 years that Congress got into the reorg business of the Department of Defense, right? In the 1947 National Security Reorganization, where we created the Department of Defense and got, there used to be a Department of Army, Department of Navy. They didn't talk to each other. In post-World War II, we took those lessons and kind of gave more power to the Joint Chiefs, et cetera. And then in 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, where we created the combatant commands and said, okay, services, you guys buy equipment and do training and whatever, but we're going to geographically cut up the world and have these specific commands. And my belief was, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this took intervention to kind of solve some problems that were structural to the services in DoD that they couldn't get out of themselves, and kind of mandate these changes. Do you think, so my question, Chris, is, given your experience in the Senate Armed Services Committee and your history in thinking about this, is this going to require some bipartisan effort where the Congress says, hey guys, this is how we need to organize, whether it's organize acquisition requirements or organize whatever, or organize services for, for these challenges? Or do you think it will come internally?
From an organizational standpoint, no, it won't come internally. It will be something, major kind of organizational reform, in my experience has tended to be something that originates outside of bureaucratic institutions. And I think, the reality is with the nature of how the DoD is structured, much of that is actually legislative. Laws would have to change to do the types of reorganization that I think we're talking about here. I would say, we did a lot in my time in the Senate on the question of reorganization, sort of splitting apart the acquisition technology logistics undersecretariat, to try to put more of an emphasis on advanced technology development, sort of writing lots of acquisition reform legislation to just try to basically kind of blow holes through the process to get more things creatively through. I'm very much a believer that there are probably organizational reforms that are going to have to happen. I do think when you look back at Goldwater Nichols, the sort of separation of the supply and demand for military power has become problematic because we've separated the owners of the problem and the providers of the solution. And that's something that, I think when we sort of divide authority and accountability in that way, we get into problems. And I think that's a function of what we have right now. But I think, the areas where I would want to see the Congress be more interventionist have to do with realigning the program. So when we say the defense program, we're actually talking about the investments in defense capabilities that the Department of Defense is making. I would like to see the Congress, kind of take more kind of ownership over its constitutional responsibilities with respect to the power of the purse, building armies, raising navies, those types of things that I think are going to be essential to scaling the kinds of investments in emerging technologies and new technologies that are going to be essential, and ultimately kind of putting the onus on the department to buy these things differently, and giving them not competitive, but giving them sort of political support to do so. So much of I think what we're talking about comes down to a question of risk and risk management. Bureaucracies, by their definition, are not supposed to be risk-taking organizations. They exist to, manage risk and limit risk, lest it turn into, existential, risk to the organization. It's going to take an external act, whether it's the Secretary of Defense coming in, working with the Congress, to essentially say, we do need to do things differently. It is going to involve more risk. And the only people who are in our system capable of doing it, who should do it, are our senior leaders, whether they're confirmed by the Senate or elected by the American people. So, I think what Congress really needs to focus on is spending its time better educating itself around the technical details of what we are going to need to be successful so that they can make informed decisions about changing the program, scaling innovation faster, putting pressure on the department to move faster to scale, and then correcting the department when it fails to do so. Those are the things that I would really like to see the Congress do before we get into, kind of redrawing the boxes on the org chart or the lines between them. I tend to think that we'll be able to make that work. And ultimately, I think what, the focus really needs to be around is on, senior leaders owning the problem and owning the, the delivery of solutions in a much more direct and personal way than, I think we've seen in recent years.
Great. Chris, so you were an insurgent in Congress, and now you're an insurgent on the outside trying to sell innovation to the department. In your book, you talk a little bit about, again, that industrial complex and the roles and the incentives around the traditional defense contractors. What's some of the lessons learned or views that you've gotten over the last 2 years or have changed vis-a-vis the traditionals and where the department and Congress need to push them?
What a great question.
So, I like to be very clear. I say it in the book, and I should say it here. I mean, I don't hate or disdain traditional defense industry. I actually think they make remarkable contributions to our national defense, have for a very long period of time. I just think that what we need in the future is going to be a lot of different types of capabilities than what they're optimized to deliver. But I'm also fully supportive of traditional defense industry changing and seeking to change to deliver those capabilities. I'm much more focused on the outcome. I don't really care who delivers it. It's about delivering the outcomes that we need and actually having a system that is designed to value and measure the outcomes that we're actually trying to buy. And that's the thing that our system doesn't do. We buy inputs, we don't buy outcomes. And we can argue to what extent that system has been optimized and shaped and influenced by the benefactors and beneficiaries of that system, and that's inevitably true. But I think there's a lot of other things going on here from the standpoint of what we talked about earlier, of just the basic incentives of how we value, sort of budget for, define the requirements for military power. And I think like the biggest thing that I believe now, that I wish I knew when I was in government, and I guess maybe I knew it, I just didn't understand it to the degree that I did, is that the only way that we're really going to change, in my view, is by trying to create more and more pockets of the defense world, defense establishment, defense portfolio or program that are open to real competition. I think oftentimes when we speak about competition in the defense sector, it's not real competition in my view. It's competition for, developing a white paper in response to a request for proposal, building a PowerPoint presentation that can, promise the government you can deliver the sun and the moon and the stars at, eye-watering prices. But in terms of actually competing to determine what actual systems can deliver the outcomes that the warfighter needs, and creating more of a marketplace where we buy more regularly, in much the same way we buy in the commercial world. Defense is never going to be like the commercial world, but it can be a little bit more like it, in the sense that we're not going to buy everything, nor should we buy everything the way we buy, Virginia-class submarines and B-21 bombers. Much of the defense program, whether it's software, whether it's weapons, whether it's low-cost unmanned systems, can be bought more like we buy commercial technology, where I actually have more choice, I have more competition, I can actually compete out, like systems against like systems, and I can on-ramp new technology every year, as opposed to, going through a very long and very legal and very bureaucratic kind of proposal process, then awarding a contract to, one performer and then treating it like, forgive me for saying this, tenure at a university where once you've got it, you never lose it. We can't treat programs that way. And I wish that we could create more kind of pockets of, marketplace type behavior where actual systems are competed out based on outcome oriented metrics. And we buy new things more regularly. And the signal to, to industry is, if you don't like the outcome this year, make some investments, fix your technology, and come back next year, because we're doing this all over again. Let's think about it more like democratic transitions of power, where you have an understanding that you may have lost this time, but you're going to have an opportunity in the very near future to win. And walk away, with real contracts. I think ultimately that's the way to kind of create the incentives for new entrants, new technologies, new investments to flow back into defense, that really creates more of an ecosystem of, of different vendors, competition, new ideas. And ultimately, I think that's what helps us manage the process of change that we're going to have to manage here, where we don't know what the world is going to look like. We don't know what our competitors are going to do. We don't know what new technologies are going to be developed next month or next year or next decade. And we ultimately don't know how we're going to want to organize ourselves and build operational concepts to employ these new technologies. So I think the best we're going to be able to do is a little bit more humility, around what is the best way to sort of experiment and feel our way through the future, and take account for what will inevitably happen, which is we're going to get things wrong, we're going to fail to predict the future, and we're going to need to end up in places that we didn't foresee. Our system is not designed to do that. Our system is designed to try to predict the future in 10 years, build requirements to what we think it's going to look like, and then throw a lot of money at industry to deliver that future on very long timelines. And shockingly, many of those things are irrelevant when they show up, if they ever show up at all. So, to me, it's much more, I wish, in answer to your question, that, I had more understanding of what that process is going to need to look like, to try to do more to, create those kinds of marketplaces or, pockets of competition while I was in government.
So Chris, we're going to take some questions for students, from students, and for everybody, I'll just take you in the order that you asked. And the first one, Phil Stifel had a great question about personnel costs vis-a-vis China. Phil, you want to ask the question?
Hey, Chris, great to meet you. I'm Phil Stiefel, 8-year Navy veteran, and in my 3rd year at Stanford here. So I read your article, The New Revolution in Military Affairs, and I noticed that it focused a lot on the cost and efficiency of technologies and weapon systems and platforms. And I'm thinking about a complementary problem to that, more focused on the personnel costs that we have right now. So China's defense budget is pegged at about 2% of its GDP. And every year, China's GDP growth outpaces ours. So if you extend that timeline out, in a few years, they're going to be, at defense budget parity with us over time, unless things change there. So in the current setup, we spend about half of our defense budget on personnel costs. For China, it's about 1/3. So in addition to automation, do you have any other recommendations or ideas for what can be done to close that gap? Do we need to look at pension reform? Do we need to crack down on disability fraud? Or is automation the least bad answer? And what are some of the limits on how far automation can help us close that gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think when you sort of analyze the defense budget as you're describing, I think, what was Secretary Gates's comment that, personnel costs are sort of eating us from the inside out is pretty apparent. And, it's why it's doubly alarming when you kind of look at the investments that we're making here in terms of growing force structure. You can bring new platforms and new technologies in and sort of spin them out on relatively fast timelines if you have to do so. Once you bring people in, they tend to stay in the organization for a very long time, and the costs of keeping them in the organization compound exponentially over time. So, at a very basic level, I would say, let's take a knee and breathe through our nose before we start, significantly increasing force structure. We tried to do a lot of things when I was in the Senate to, limit the growth in personnel costs in terms of looking at retirement reform, TRICARE reform, kind of health reform. Those were very difficult reforms to move through, and we always ended up with a heck of a lot less than we would have wanted. It's never popular to try to essentially kind of walk back or minimize or unwind benefits that people believe they were given or entitled to, and that's understandable. I get it. I think as I think about kind of autonomy, it's not to I think the wrong way to think about it is that somehow it's going to enable us to cut sort of 50% of the people out of our organization. I think the different way of thinking about it is it's going to make the people we do have in our organization exponentially more capable. I think of these technologies fundamentally as how to enhance the ability of human beings to do things that they currently can't. Kind of across that kill chain process of understanding and generating insights from large amounts of data, making better and faster decisions at scale. Ultimately overseeing and sort of commanding and controlling more actions in military competition. I think the real value of these technologies is that it's going to enable the people we have to sort of punch, exponentially above their own limitations, which are fundamentally cognitive in nature. That, many of these processes, these competitions, these systems are just cognitively difficult. I mean, as you know better than anybody, you cognitively fatigue trying to manage these very manual, very time-intensive, very complex systems. So how can you essentially offload more of that cognitive activity to more autonomous, more intelligent systems? Not as a way of replacing the human, but empowering the human to do more, be better, act at greater scale. So I see that as really kind of the value proposition here. And, I think the sooner we can kind of get to that world, the better off we'll be. And, I think the challenge is, yeah, you're going to have to continue to try to manage, intelligent reforms through the process that limit the growth in your out-year costs for personnel. We definitely, as we move into, a new era of defense austerity, which we're headed into in a big way, we should not be adding large quantities of people to our organization for all the reasons you said. And then I think fundamentally we need to make investments in these technologies that enable our humans to get to do more high value work, which I think is ultimately what the real game is here.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
We had a question. Actually, Janani got two questions in one about China's 5-year plan and the U.S. relationship with its commercial companies. Janani, would you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So my first question had to do with, it was actually in response to a comment that popped up on chat, but it was whether China's 5-year plans are keeping them, more competitive, or whether there is a certain amount of threat that they could overtake the US given that their 5-year plans. And the other question had to do with whether you think startups can kind of bridge the culture gap between the private sector and the public sector, in the sense that, of course, the private sector currently isn't always very on board with the defense sector. So bridging that gap, how you think startups, and particularly your role with Anduril Industries, could help bridge that gap.
Yeah. So I guess, taking the second question first, here too, I'm an optimist. I mean, I don't think that the overwhelming majority of, of engineers, dig the shades, by the way. I don't think the overwhelming majority of engineers are uninterested in working on defense problems. I actually think the opposite is true. I think you see a lot of, kind of people taking opinions, writing letters to their leadership, but they're kind of a minority inside of their own organizations. I think the reality is that, you have a lot of engineers who are interested in doing this work because, at the end of the day, they believe it's the right thing to do. I think you have a lot of them who are interested in doing it because they believe it could be a path to success and personal sort of professional growth and fulfillment. And ultimately, I think you see a lot of them who are eager to do this work because they became engineers because they're attracted to really hard problems. And, the defense world, if you can say nothing about it, has, a significant amount of really hard, cool, compelling problems. So, I absolutely believe that the willingness is there. I think what needs to change are the incentives that would lead, your best sort of Stanford educated software developer, computer science graduates, to want to go work on national defense problems as opposed to, write, cat facial recognition algorithms for Facebook. That is ultimately a set of incentives that the government can help to create. In terms of your founders who are going to want to found a company that's going to give them meaning and enable them to make impact. Why are they going to start a defense company as opposed to a commercial technology company? And then investors, investors are very rarely ideological. They're looking to make a return on their investment. And if defense is going to yield great returns on investment, maybe not what, commercial software companies are going to return, but significantly above what, kind of passes for successful growth in the defense sector to date, money is going to flow into those problems. So I do believe the Department of Defense and the Congress, the US government, can create the incentives to take advantage of, I think the willingness and ability to solve these problems at scale. It's just something that they need to do, and they need to sort of take a series of actions differently than what they've been doing for the past 3 decades. But it's eminently doable in my opinion. And I think that's kind of a thesis of ours at Anduril, which is, if you want companies to be successful doing defense work, you have to give them the ability to, build defense products, build defense technology and scale it. if you continue to force them to subsist, on small SBIR account, grants and, $1 million research here and there, don't expect any of them to scale, and expect most of them to wash out and go look for, more lucrative work elsewhere. To your first question.
So Chris, before you go to the first question, I know she had a twofer, but Emily had a question which actually kind of complements this one. And Emily, I think your question was, given this need to work with companies, how does the DoD better message to Silicon Valley? Emily, are you there? Was that your question?
Hi, yeah, that was my question, which, yeah, you definitely have been touching on in Janani's, in answer to Janani's question. So your book talks about the tension between Washington and Silicon Valley in terms of perceived values, hindering the national security cooperation. And so I was wondering if you would be able to talk a little bit about how the Department of Defense could better potentially message its mission and objectives so that it resonates with Silicon Valley. So
yeah, I'm getting a ton of feedback here from somebody. I think I don't know, whoever's on wireless there, go mute, thanks. I honestly think this isn't a communications problem. We tend to try to treat it as a communications problem where the Department of Defense just has to better tell its story. You guys tell me, you're out there. My sense is Silicon Valley is sort of tired of, DoD technology tourism. They're interested in seeing people actually put their money where their mouth is, which is, it's great. Sure. SecDef came back to Palo Alto or Silicon Valley or wherever, did another roundtable of meetings. But, if you actually value this work, it's not enough to say it. Where are the contracts, for large amounts of money going to companies that are doing differentiated technology development to help them scale it? So the department will sort of say one thing, but then when you look at where actually all the money is going, it's not going to those things, not even close.
So Chris, let me interrupt and maybe help Emily refine, or you refine the answer, or Emily refine the question. I think there are two audiences implicit in her question. One is the one you just talked about, which are the CEOs and investors in a company who want to decide whether the company should work with the DoD. But Emily, I think part of your question is, how do you convince the mass of students and engineers and everybody else who just forget about the financial things, just want nothing with the DoD? Yeah, I was trying to mind read, but was that what you had in mind for the question?
yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is, not knowing what all of those people think, my assumption about it is that the preponderance of engineers are not, so completely ideologically opposed to working with the Department of Defense that if the Department of Defense showed up with very compelling problems and a large amount of money that they were prepared to invest in those companies to help to solve them, that you would see people saying, no, actually, I'm not interested. I think that we need to test the proposition that people aren't interested. Because I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is, yeah, people have expressed, a lack of interest or a lack of willingness. But the reality is that the department has created zero financial incentives for companies to want to do this work at all. So I'd like to see us test the proposition that, if we really put our money where our mouth was, somehow the overwhelming majority of leading technology developers in America wouldn't be interested in doing this work for whatever reason I mentioned earlier, patriotism, capitalism, or just like sheer love of hard problems. I tend to think that that's not true. And, maybe a subset of them wouldn't be interested, but you would create a brand new subset of new companies that would be. And fine, if Google doesn't want to do the work, someone else will do the work and scale on the basis of it to become, the next great defense company. That's the way it should work. And that's the kind of incentives that I think the department needs to think about influencing and changing with the single biggest thing that they can pull the lever on, which is what they spend money on. I'm tired of hearing Department of Defense leaders say that they value artificial intelligence and great software, but not actually putting their money behind it. Like, if you value it, you will buy it. at scale. Like, I think that we're radically overthinking a lot of this problem of innovation and turning it into, sort of a contest of ideology and, sort of psychological introspection and, what do we need, like what magic words and sort of dog whistle pitches does the department has to sort of hit to convince everybody to work with us? It's like, no one wants to work with you because you don't actually value the things that these people are doing. You think software is witchcraft. You want it for free. Now you think you're going to build it yourself. And then all of the money gets shoveled out the door to the same 5 national defense contractors that you've been paying for the past 3 decades. So, of course they don't value you as a partner because you don't treat them seriously and buy the things that they're developing. So, I don't mean to be kind of, flip about it. I just think that, I get so frustrated with the debate in Washington around, sort of how we think about leading technology development in America. The people who do this work are exceptionally good. And somehow, we want to basically buy their remarkable capability based on, some ridiculous business model of like how many people working, how many hours did it take to produce it? It's like, that's not how you actually buy good things. It was like 5 people who built it. They're exceptional. They're like NBA athlete level quality. They're all making like millions of dollars a year, and they should be. And your system can't account for that level of talent. The question is like, do you want that level of, quality of capability, or do you not? And if you do, you have to pay for it.
Okay.
You don't get it for free, and you don't get it from companies that don't have that expertise. So, I just would love to see the department, actually start thinking about like economics 101 and what actually, sort of moves the needle for companies. We make so many decisions in the defense world based on sort of quote unquote, the health of the industrial base. And usually what it means is, we've got to give a contract to Boeing because if we don't do it, they're not going to develop advanced, fighter aircraft anymore. I'd like to see us factoring in the industrial base from the standpoint of how do I create incentives for more, leading technology developers to want to work for and with the United States government and Department of Defense. And I think when it comes to what really moves the needle for those types of companies and those types of engineers, it's not clear to me that the department actually understands what it's talking about, because they sort of continue to say one thing, but then their behavior is fundamentally the same as it's always been.
So Chris, your career has been started in speech writing and communications, and obviously your book is kind of almost the pinnacle of that, of the intersection of policy and communications. Noma had a great question, and I'm going to let her ask it, but I really think it gets to the heart of some of the things you've been trying to teach us about the lessons you've learned about building, buy-in and consensus. Noma, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was exactly to that point, which is, I'm just curious if you can give us any anecdotes or examples or lessons you learned about how to build buy-in, especially on a difficult decision, and what are kind of the do's and don'ts of political communication. And thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, I guess, it starts first at the level of just understanding, who are the core stakeholders in a decision that has to be made. Those are the people who are going to stand to benefit. They're the people who are going to stand to lose. And you need to understand, kind of what that orbit of people looks like. And I think all too often, we want to kind of hand wave that stuff away and say, people will just see the merit of the argument. They'll just be won over by the sheer brilliance of my speech or my presentation or my decision. My kind of big takeaway from the book, or kind of thesis of the book, is the only way we're going to change is through the system we have, not by trying to magic it away and sort of hope that our system of government or, kind of our military industrial congressional complex is going to be different than what it is. And I think that's the kind of the impetus or the focus of what you're asking. So, or a decision that's going to be difficult, right? That's not just going to be immediately obvious and universally supported. The way I thought about it when I was on the Hill was, you want to try to build as much buy-in as you possibly can. You want to try to identify the people who can be won over. You want to try to win them over. You want to try to isolate people who are going to be opposed to you and, you know, irreconcilable. Not for bad reasons. I mean, oftentimes for very good reasons, right? It's because they stand to lose something that is truly of value to them or to their constituents or to their company. And they have absolutely every reason, motivation, and right to fight against it. And I don't begrudge them that. But the reality is that on certain types of things, you know, even people who you can sympathize with need to lose. And the question is, how can you create a sort of decision-making process that isolates the losers in a way that limits their ability to create, you know, or to be spoilers. And then ultimately, you know, you don't want someone to just kind of lose completely. You know, wherever you can find an opportunity for them to sort of, you know, to save face, to walk away with a half a loaf of bread, you know, to get a win on some other issue, even if they're losing on this issue. You know, that was one of the core things that we always had to manage in the course of producing the defense bill, which was, you know, it's sort of what we used to refer to as like the arithmetic of pain. You know, you could only pile so much pain up on a given person before they just said, like, I'm out, I'm not going to support this, it's too bad. You had to figure out, it's like, look, I'm gonna force pain on you here, but you're gonna get some victories over here to offset it. And those, I think, were the things that, you know, we had to think about in terms of managing a difficult decision through the process where you were going to have losers. It was unavoidable. And sometimes you just had to isolate them and outvote them. But you always wanted to find a way to bring them along where you could. And ultimately, it goes back to the first point, which was understanding the motivations of why a person was going to be opposed, so you could take certain arguments off the table, and then really try to isolate the problems and attempt to solve them more, you know, more specifically. I don't know if that answers your question.
Chris, I think that was a roadmap for how to make friends and influence people, so and get legislation passed. So thank you. I think, Arlena, you had actually two questions, but maybe the first one I thought was really interesting. I mean, they're all interesting, but I think the one about is the in the military issue of tech acquisition or change in mindset. Was that your question, Arlena?
Yes, sir. So you mentioned earlier, and also in your article in Foreign Affairs, that the US military is still holding on to these assumptions that are actually outdated, which are affecting its mindset, and it's creating a false sense of superiority. So do you think that does the issue lie on acquisitions of new technologies and its quick adaptation to new and transformation to new military capabilities, or is that more of a mindset issue where the military as a whole, to include the high or key leaders and civilian leaders, are stuck in that old mindset and are not really focusing on what's important?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. You know, I think that there's plenty of problems with our acquisition system, you know, how we kind of develop and buy technology. I think at a more fundamental level, the question you're getting at is, you know, at the end of the day, technology is just a tool. And, you know, there are plenty of examples through history where competitors had, you know, kind of technological parity, but, you know, one side outthought the other, or was more creative in their employment of technology, and they gained an advantage as a result of it. So, you know, I think it does come down to the mindset, you know, so that it's not just about technological innovation, it's about operational innovation, you know, what you use technology to do, how you use it to solve problems differently. Rather than just sort of trying to solve the problem the same way with just incrementally better and better tools. And then I think it's about organizational innovation of, you know, how do I actually organize myself differently to take advantage of new capabilities or new operational concepts. And I think all of those things have to work together to sort of generate the type of advantages we're talking about. And, you know, I think the problem comes down to what I think you're getting at here, which is, you know, we don't have a system, we have a system that's far too geared around valuing and buying inputs rather than defining what we want our outcomes to be, and buying capabilities and generating ideas and generating sort of new organizational change that allows us to field better and better solutions to solve those problems. You know, we talk constantly about our requirements in the Defense Department or the defense world, by which we mean, you know, the very specific, you know, kind of specifications that we want technology to have. And, you know, my joke is that if you'd asked me to define my requirements for a phone 15 years ago, you know, I would currently have the best flip phone in the world, but I sure as hell wouldn't have an iPhone. We've got to get out of this sort of hubristic trap of trying to specifically define, you know, the requirements for our, you know, our inputs, and actually value new and innovative and completely unpredictable and surprising, you know, capabilities, concepts, and organizational innovation that allows us to solve these problems differently. And that's
sounds like Silicon Valley, Chris.
I mean, maybe, I don't know. I actually think it's just logic, you know, that if you really want to solve the problem, you've got to create the types of incentives that allow you to solve it differently, because the problem's is gonna move on you. And, you know, we've not optimized our system to do that. You know, we've done the opposite, unfortunately.
So Maddie had a question. Thank you, Chris, about, you know, are there past lessons, an existing doctrine while we embrace new technology like AI for modern warfare, or are we going to have to come up with, you know, new doctrine? Maddie, was that your question? Did I get it right?
Yes, sir. So how do we pretty much harness those new technologies, but still utilize past doctrine and those lessons that we've learned from previous warfare, and in order to make sure that we're still preparing adequately for today and tomorrow's war?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, you know, sort of similar to what I was just saying, you know, where we first need to accept that, and it's okay to say this, we don't know what we're trying to do. We have a sense of the problems we're trying to solve. We have a sense of the technologies that might be important, but we don't actually know what solutions are going to be better than others, what ideas are better than others, what capabilities are going to be differentiated from others. And that's okay. You know, I would love for the Department of Defense and, you know, just our world in Washington to be more accepting of that, rather than trying to say, no, like I can predict exactly what the world is going to look like in 2030 and begin building it now. It's just not how this is going to work. So, you know, I'd like to see us, you know, better able and willing to put in place a process that allows us to define the types of solutions we're going to need through the process of experimentation and sort of iterative development. You know, like this isn't going to be, you know, all the king's horses and all the king's men sitting in some dark room somewhere that have a flash of insight and say, you know, we know what 2035 is going to look like, and all the technologies that are going to deliver military dominance, and we can start building it on 5-year plans. You know, we need to have processes that account for the fact that we're going to get this stuff wrong. And I think this is where the Department of Defense just misunderstands Silicon Valley. You know, from my time working at Anduril, you know, what's been very clear to me is that the only way technology develops is by bounding problems very specifically, very narrowly, in a rather unsexy way, and just solving them in like 3 months. And then sort of bounding the next hardest, you know, kind of version of that problem and iteratively moving through the process of change in a way that looks incremental, but is actually transformational. Because it allows you to account for the fact that you don't really know where you're going, even if you have a general vector. You don't know what all of those solutions to all of those problems you're going to encounter are going to be. And that's something that I don't think the Department of Defense does well. And something that I think we just need to be a little bit humbler about the way these types of technologies are going to get developed, refined, and fielded. And ultimately the way I think we need to build and deploy military power in the future.
Well, thanks, Chris. I think that was just a really great answer. And I think you've already answered this, but Myrnal had a question about scaling innovation. How do you create an environment where a company doesn't have to be founded by billionaires to sell innovative solutions? And I think your answer, if I heard it right, was, well, they need to be writing checks for billions to new entrants. But Marinel, did I get your question correct?
Yeah, it was on point. Hey, Chris, I was an Andrew over the summer.
What's up, man? Yeah, good to see you.
The answer regarding retaining engineers, clearly branded merchandise. My one, I guess the follow-up there would be, point is taken that you just have to put your money where your mouth is. We've seen the horse blanket chart a number of times this class. And for especially a smaller startup that's working on earlier technology, how do you kind of create the machinery that's going to hand it off to the right people at the right time with the right incentives to not let it die in the valley of death or somewhere in that wasteland?
You mean hand it off from the standpoint of, kind of executing a transition, or handing it off to, kind of an end user?
More the transition. How do you get early TRL technology to the next set of interested stakeholders and keep moving it forward till it's a real capability?
Yeah. I think it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about of, the way that you ultimately sort of build that bridge across the valley of death is kind of one plank at a time. It's not something that, is going to happen all at once. It's something that you have to have, kind of a structure in place. You have to have, a willingness on the part of the government to say, we've seen enough to have confidence in the capability and the team that's building it, that this is scalable, and that there's need to scale it. But then you need to sort of create, I think, the environment of stability, and the sort of support structure, the sort of, the pressure to perform that's going to be required to get across it, rather than say, we're basically going to force you to live, kind of contracting action to contracting action, every 3 to 6 months. Our mutual colleague and friend, Matt Steckman, has a great line that, the difference between one $10 million contract and 10 $1 million contracts is the difference between, actual innovation and basically just frittering away money. And the department needs to think more in those terms of, how do I create, kind of a financial incentive and a demand signal, to a company to say there's value in what you're doing, and we want to field it, scale it, and deploy it far and wide. And we want to give you the time and the space to productize it, mature it, work with end users to improve it, and ultimately, put your own investment into it. Be as willing to believe in your own success as we are, in the form that you're actually going to invest your own capital to make this go, and you're going to be able to raise additional capital on the basis of this work. I think that's, that to me is the question of how you scale and how you get across that valley of death. And, unfortunately, those are the mechanisms that I still don't see in place in the Department of Defense. We've created a lot of innovation organizations designed to bring, more and more companies in to do small pilot projects or build a new, kind of small prototype. But there's no mechanism to then say, great, we've got a lot of companies with like seed rounds, for lack of a better term, who needs to now be kind of winnowed down to get that next stage of investment, to really scale up.
And Chris, I think you just described the difference between innovation theater and innovation. Innovation theater is, we tell Congress we have a lot of these incubators and accelerators, and innovation is we're writing $100 million and $1 billion checks to people whose names we didn't know before.
That's right.
I think that was your point.
Totally.
I'm gonna throw one in here because we're getting close to the end, but. And I don't know if this is in your bailiwick, but just for the class to think about as well, part of innovation is kind of dependent on, as some or all of the military is still using an organizational staff structure that was developed in the Napoleonic Wars, probably by Napoleon. The who we have on each level of staff, but there is no structure that takes into account disruptive innovation. And do we need to change some of the basic structure of how staff is organized, inside the DoD? I don't know if that you've been thinking about that or at all.
Yeah, I think in certain ways, those are things that I can absolutely see as changes we're going to have to make. I wouldn't start by pointing the finger at it as, you know, kind of the major impediment or blocker to the kinds of change that I think we're talking about here. Like, put it this way, if I had the, you know, the ability to sort of, you know, magic one action onto the Department of Defense, I would rather them keep their Napoleonic staff structure and actually put their money where their mouth is in terms of writing larger checks to develop and field, you know, advanced technology at scale, rather than, you know, kind of an organizational change, because I don't necessarily think that the one is a function of the other. You know, I think that they, within their kind of current staff structure, could be creating different incentives and behaving differently. Now, where I would agree is that I think in the fullness of time, these are things that are going to have to change, because the way we have divided ourselves up inside of the defense world, geographically, you know, kind of distinct combatant commands, geographic sort of domains, you know, where military services are based around the sea, the land, space. You know, the technologies we're talking about here are ultimately software defined, and software doesn't see domains. Software doesn't see, you know, kind of lines on the map. You know, we're talking about joint all domain command and control as, you know, the sort of preeminent, you know, conceptual and capability challenge for the Department of Defense. That is fundamentally not built around the ways that we organize ourselves to date. You know, and I think a lot of those kind of false divisions are going to have to fade away. There will be other divisions. I mean, we have to organize ourselves somehow, and by organizing, we will create fault lines. I think we need to have an organization with a different set of fault lines than the one we have today, because it's harder to work across them than it is not. So having different fault lines would be more helpful.
And we had we're getting close to quitting time, but we had a great question from Brad Jackson about, you know, students in this class, students in Stanford, students in other universities. And Brad, if I get your question right, it's how do you get involved in the intersection of advanced tech and national security? Is it a sector or company? Brad, was that question?
Yeah, that was correct. Thank you, Jess, for your time. I appreciate it. Basically, yeah, I was just going to get your thoughts on maybe the best pathways from your experiences being on the Hill in government, private sector, now at a startup, of best pathways of getting involved in that intersection of emerging and advanced technologies. You know, especially for me personally, I'm a first-year Master's in International Policy student, straight from undergrad. And your book had a pretty profound impact on me in terms of sort of these critical issues. And so I was just wondering, from your experiences, what are sort of the better ways, if there are any?
I don't think there are better ways. You know, you can kind of look at my resume, and in retrospect, it all looks like it was the product of some grand strategy of, you know, professional career planning genius. You know, I just basically did one damn thing after the next based on the thing that was exciting to me at the moment. And, you know, you know, you should have goals. I'm not trying to dissuade you from having goals. I would just say, you know, look, my advice on this is there's lots of ways to get involved, you know, whether it's on the government side or the industry side, the congressional side, the executive branch side. You know, there's a lot of ways to get involved. You know, I think it's fundamentally around finding the way that's best for you and getting into a place where, you know, people you care about are working on problems that you care about. And my experience has been that if you find yourself into that type of a place and you work hard and you apply yourself, like, doors will open that you can't foresee. And when you see it, you just need to walk through it. And, you know, I think in that vein, you know, what I would put in a plug for specifically, if you're thinking about government, anybody on this line is thinking about government service, public service, and I hope that you are, definitely spend time on Capitol Hill. There are a lot more jobs than there are in the executive branch. They're a lot easier to find and get into oftentimes than jobs in the executive branch. And at the end of the day, I think you have a lot more, responsibility than you would otherwise, I think, have the opportunity to get inside of the executive branch, where you're going to be playing an important role, albeit in a much narrower, you know, kind of lane. Congress, in my opinion, is, you know, entrepreneurial. There's not a lot of sort of vertical layers of bureaucracy, and you know, for all of its faults, it is a pretty meritocratic place. You know, talent really does kind of move, you know, into the best jobs, and it is rewarded. And particularly on these kinds of national security issues, it's a pretty small subset of people who, you know, work on a very bipartisan basis to solve hard problems. And you know, I think the opportunity to play a role there, you're going to see a lot, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to figure out a lot about yourself. You know, I thought that I would go work on Capitol Hill. First of all, I had no desire to do it when I was offered an opportunity to do it. You know, I belief about Capitol Hill was born through my time at the State Department, believing that, you know, I kind of wish the founders had just created two branches of government and let the courts and the executive branch fight it out. But you know, when I decided to go to Capitol Hill, my thought was, you know, I'd work there for 2, maybe 3 years. You know, I'd learn something one way or the other, and I'd be better off for it. You know, 9 years later, I left having had multiple different jobs, having done the opportunity to do things that I never would have expected going in. And I don't think that experience is uncommon for people on the Hill. So yeah, I would just put in a plug for working on Capitol Hill, because I think it gives you a lot of ability to learn. A lot of awesome experience that gives you, you know, kind of optionality for what you do after it. And it's a lot of fun. It's a great place to be.
So Chris, what a wonderful way to end the session. And thank you for your time. We know you have a day job and this is night duty. I think I learned a ton. I know our students had. Raj, you have any, Joe, you have some closing comments for Chris?
Sure, I'll do something. I'll turn it over to Joe. So yeah, Chris, just thank you for all that you did and have done and are continuing to do, both in Congress, now at Andrel, and with your book. I mean, I think there is a rising tide, and you're certainly at the vanguard. So, and thanks again for your time today. Very insightful to have the author of our primary book to be able to discuss directly. I'd like to take maybe 20 seconds now with the rest of the class and just preview what we're going to do on Thursday. So this Thursday, we're going to talk, this is the last one around our section about how DoD works before we get into the project section. And we'll have as our guest speaker, Dr. Will Roper, who has been one of the leading innovators in the department and in the Air Force on how do we solve a lot of these problems that we've been discussing, and what are things to pilot. So we'll have a series of readings, but please do bring your questions on. Where do we go from here?
I was just piling on, just thanking Chris again. Chris, really, I think you're just a real inspiration, role model for our students. And, you know, we've served in different capacities. I think you're demonstrating that you obviously served in significant ways in DC on the Hill and state, but I think you're still serving us all now with some of these ideas. If we're going to, you know, avoid that scenario that you describe in your book, it's going to be through a lot of effort and similar efforts that you're leading now in the private sector. But I'm sure we'll see you back on the home team at some point soon too. But really, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys. No, it's a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Take care. Joe, any closing words for the class?
No, as Raj said, you know, we got a great speaker for next week, and we're going to tie this into Chris's great teeing up some really important issues for the class. And I think, Chris, you really just, that was the thesis for the class in so many ways. And we're going to pull out some of your greatest hits quotes from this section. But look forward to seeing you Thursday. And then we're going to transition after this to introducing some of the technologies in part 2 of the class. But
and just a heads up for the class, one of our guest speakers on space, we couldn't think of anybody better to get than the head of Space Force. So General Raymond will be our speaker on, what is it, the 27th, Joe, is that right?
Sure is, 27th.
27th. So queue up your questions then, and lots of great speakers between now and then as well. We're going to bring everybody here, guys. So sharpen your questions. These were great, and very impressive that you asked such insightful questions to Chris.
And Steve, great job facilitating tonight.
All right. We'll see you guys on Thursday. Remember, you could email us, office hours, chat, anything you'd like in between class. Take care.
Our TAs, could you hang on? We'll just go do a quick logistics update if you could stick around.
Thank you.